Today we have with us Ashley Bates. Ashley Bates is a colleague here at the International Institute and serves currently as project coordinator at the II's Conflict and Peace Initiative. Previously, she worked as an independent journalist in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and the United States. She also worked for 8 years as program director and then later as executive director of an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue program called Hands of Peace. Ashley lived in Gaza for 6 months in 2010, where she covered a grassroots nonviolent activist movement that expanded rapidly following Israel's deadly raid on a Gaza-bound humanitarian flotilla. The movement subsequently fizzled, and multiple activists were killed. Ashley's articles have been published in The Nation, Haaretz, Mother Jones, Global Post, the East Bay Express, Journalism Post Magazine, and the Columbia Journalism Review. Her 2010 blog, Dispatches from Gaza, recounts her experiences working as a journalist in Gaza. Please join me in welcoming Ashley Bates.
Good, mic-wise? Okay. Hi. So as Sabra said, the topic of my talk is a nonviolent activist movement that I covered when I was working as a journalist in Gaza for 6 months in 2010. I'll talk about how it got started, what it looked like at its peak, and why I think this movement ultimately fizzled despite it having a lot of promise. All the pictures you'll see in this presentation are pictures that I took, with two exceptions that I'll point out. So to give you a sense of where this is going, as I started to put this presentation together, I realized there was a lot of important background information that you would need to understand in order to understand the story I'm going to tell. So the first half of this presentation is going to be background information about me, about the land and the recent history of Gaza, and particularly the impact of the land and sea blockade of Gaza, which people in Gaza typically refer to as the siege, and about overall Western mainstream media silent on ongoing suffering in Gaza, with a few notable exceptions that I'll discuss. And from there, I'll dive into the story of Gaza's short-lived nonviolent activist protest movement in 2010. Okay, so first some important background about me. One important thing to know about me is that I worked for 8 years directing an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue program. For most of those 8 years, this was a part-time job during the year and a full-time job in the summer, and the rest of the time I was working as a journalist. Hands of Peace participants are teenagers that come from the West Bank, Israel, and the US. They tend to be, not always, but tend to be higher income kids. And still many have horrific stories in connection to the conflict. Many have lost loved ones to the conflict. But still at Hands of Peace, there's an overall sense of hopefulness. At the end of the day, they're kids coming together, forming themselves in the shape of a peace sign, talking about their personal stories, and forming friendship despite the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At Hands of Peace, everybody talked about Gaza. It was even a focus often in the dialogues, but no one, including the Palestinian participants who came from the West Bank, which is territorially separate from Gaza, had ever been to Gaza. So Gaza was in the room, and yet it was completely out of the room. You know, we didn't have any representation in the dialogue, just like Gaza is rarely represented in a human way in the news coverage. So I went to Gaza because I wanted to see it for myself, and because I thought maybe I could make some small impact through the stories I could tell as a journalist. Getting in was quite an ordeal, but that's sort of a different story that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. What I found in Gaza were destruction everywhere and a pervading sense. This is me in front of one of a million, maybe not a million, but thousands of destroyed buildings in Gaza. That's what you see everywhere. It's just death and destruction everywhere. There's not a sense of hopefulness. There's a sense of dread. There's no escape from trauma. There's a war and a massive air assault every few years. Everyone has lost a loved one. Children are terrified by the sound of drones in the sky, and after a couple of months, I got scared of the sound too. At Hands of Peace, I knew so many kind and courageous Israelis. I'm married to one of them. But in Gaza, Israelis are the drones in the sky, the gunboats on the water, the tanks on the border. There's no human interaction whatsoever. People in Gaza did know that I worked for an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue program for many reasons. I was quite intentional about not hiding this fact. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A and about how people reacted to that fact. A final important thing to understand is that about Gaza and is that Israel's policy of collective punishment is for actions taken by Hamas or other extremist groups is an established reality in Gaza. It means that death can come at any moment just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This makes even the existence of a small nonviolent activist movement all the more remarkable. So, more background, who lives in Gaza? Again, an important thing to understand if you're not familiar with, or starting to get familiar with the conflict, is that Gaza is completely territorially separate from the West Bank. There's no interaction between Palestinians from the West Bank and Palestinians from Gaza. It's extraordinarily rare, almost impossible, even when in extreme cases where there's someone who's dying in a family and a family member who lives in the West Bank wants to see a family member in Gaza who's before they pass away, chances are there's no way that they're going to get permission to enter. And I'll come back to this map throughout the presentation, but also important to note that Gaza is almost entirely surrounded by Israel, and there's a small piece of the border that it shares with Egypt. There's only two ways to enter. One is through the Erez crossing with Israel, which is right here in the north, and the other is through the Rafah crossing with Egypt, which is in the south. There's no airport. Those are the only two ways, besides the tunnels, which I'll talk about later, that you can get into Gaza. Okay, so who lives in Gaza? Sorry. Lost my train of thought. So 68% of people in Gaza are refugees registered with UNRWA. These are refugees from the 1948 war that established Israel's independence, and their families used to live in what is now Israel. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth, 1.8 million people. And it's really tiny. It takes about 2 hours to drive from the north to the south. It used to be sort of a liberal Muslim area, and it's become extremely religiously conservative in the past few decades. The vast majority of women wear a headscarf, and it's much more conservative than the West Bank. Except in a small area of Gaza City, I wore an abaya and a hijab, which I wouldn't do in the West Bank. In the West Bank, I would dress like this. 80% of people are below the poverty line. 70% receive humanitarian aid. The official unemployment number is 41%. But I can tell you anecdotally that the actual unemployment number is probably much higher than that. You know, a lot of those 60% that are seeking employment and are employed are marginally employed, you know, a few hours a week. The vast majority of people you meet in Gaza are not employed. 8 hours of electricity per day, roughly. There's recent reports of 4 hours now per day of electricity. There's rolling blackouts, so unless you're wealthy enough to have an electric generator, you're in the dark. Another uncommon thing that you don't really think about is most of the population are kids under the age of 15. 59% of these kids are anemic, and a recent World Bank report said that only 10% of people in Gaza have access to safe drinking water. So in a nutshell, it's just an absolutely devastated place. Questions that I often got even when I was in Gaza were things like, you know, if they would only not teach their children to hate, things could be so much better. Isn't there rampant anti-Semitism in Gaza? And those sorts of questions make sense when you're standing in America, but when you're standing in Gaza and seeing stuff like this, you really feel like, gosh, those questions are kind of missing the point. You know, it seems very unfair to expect people whose most basic needs for sustenance and safety are not being met to be full of kindness and forgiveness toward the state that's oppressing them. Okay, so some recent history of Gaza, again, important context. Any of you who have traveled to Israel recognize this photo? This smokestack might look familiar if you've been to southern Israel. Anyone? Yes, so that is the big smokestack that you can see in southern Israel that I'd seen many times. It's right near the coast, and it was it's the port of Ashdod. It's the smoke tower there that you can sort of see from miles around, and it was a emotional photo for me to take. I took this from the coastline in Gaza because it's like a canoe ride away, maybe kind of a long canoe ride, but you could, not that far. It's so close. It's a world I know. I've been to Israel many times. I've worked in Israel for many years, and yet it seems like a world away. And that's how everything feels in Gaza. You feel as if progress is happening everywhere else, and you are just trapped here, forgotten by the world. I'm going to go over very briefly, this is extremely hard to summarize, some recent history of Gaza in that context, and then I'm happy, during the Q&A, if you have more questions about this history, I'm happy to go into more details. So in 2005, Israel withdrew from its settlements in Gaza. These settlements are Jewish-only communities with their own infrastructure, their own roads. The roads going to settlements are much nicer than the Palestinian roads. Now that the settlements are gone, you can still see the dramatic difference just in the quality of the roads. And the settlements have their own protection from the IDF. The only way that Palestinians in Gaza could enter the settlements is with a permit, and that was usually because, ironically, they were going into work as construction workers and help build or expand the settlements. In 2006, one other important thing to note about the settlements, when Israel devised its voluntary plan to disengage from the settlements, to remove the settlers forcibly from Gaza and implement a blockade that just kept Gaza and Israel separate, Ariel Sharon, senior advisor and one of the main architects of the plan, said to an interviewer that the withdrawal was designed to, quote, put the peace process in formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So it wasn't just an act of disengaging from the settlements. It was also, for many of the political leaders behind the settlements, an act of disengaging from the peace process itself. In 2006, there were elections for the first time in Palestine. Hamas won the elections. This was in the context of widespread disenchantment with Fatah, the more moderate Palestinian political party. Hamas, as I'm sure most of you know, is considered a terrorist organization in the West and has very extreme views in regards to Israel and the use of violence against Israeli civilians. To many people in Gaza, Fatah was widely and correctly seen as a corrupt organization that was misusing public funds, was unresponsive to civilian needs, whereas Hamas for decades had been providing things like healthcare and home reconstruction to people with no other recourse. So for a lot of people who had followed developments on the ground for a long time, it wasn't such a huge surprise that Hamas won these elections. After the elections, a civil war broke out in Gaza between Hamas and Fatah. Nobody won. 600 or so people were killed. It's a trauma that is still strongly felt in Gaza. And Hamas won the military victory and became the de facto rulers of Gaza, whereas Fatah and the Palestinian Authority became the de facto rulers of the West Bank. So again, back to this map, Fatah ruling the West Bank, Hamas ruling Gaza. One side note, sometimes people ask me, like, how could you engage with Hamas? Like, why would you do that? And when Hamas rules Gaza, you have to understand that means they rule Gaza. You cannot not engage. As soon as you enter Gaza, it's Hamas checking your passport. They decide where you can live and not live in Gaza. They are your protection to some extent in Gaza. Their security guards are outside the places where you're staying. They are the rulers. They are the government of Gaza. So you can't go to Gaza and not interact with Hamas. In 2008 and in December of 2008 and into January of 2009, there was I'm so sorry. Backing up, I'm losing my train of thought here. 2007, after the civil war and after Hamas takes control of Gaza, Israel severely tightens its blockade, which is a policy it had been implementing for a while, but to a much more mild extent. It effectively closed the Erez crossing right here, and cooperated with Egypt, which this was Hosni Mubarak's government. They feared an alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Hamas in Gaza. They closed their border. So that effectively sealed off the two ways to get into Gaza. And imports and exports were slowed to a crawl. It was almost impossible if you're a farmer in Gaza to export your goods across the border. Dov Weinglass, who was then a senior advisor to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, said that this Israeli policy, this blockade policy, was designed to, quote, put Palestinians on a diet but not make them die of hunger. In 2012, it was revealed that in early 2008, Israeli authorities drew up a document that calculated the minimum caloric intake necessary for Palestinians to avoid malnutrition so that it could limit the amount of foodstuffs allowed into Gaza without causing outright starvation. So some examples of food items that were restricted under this 2007 blockade and at various points throughout the blockade: pasta, flour, yeast, rice, salt, sugar, black pepper, garlic, cinnamon, cooking oil, instant coffee, chickpeas. This was not a blockade on military equipment. This was a blockade on, basic food sustenance items, also on sanitary items, baby wipes, toilet paper, shampoo, detergent, school supplies, including textbooks, notebooks, and pens, fuel, and then dual-use items that could be used for weapons, fuel, seeds, plastic irrigation piping, various agricultural supplies, cement. So this is a blockade on imports and exports. It means Gaza is basically sealed off from the world. In 2008 and 2009, there is a war between Hamas and Israel. Hamas and other extremist groups prior to the war had been building tunnels under the border to try to attack Israel, and various militant groups had fired rockets into southern Israel that were terrorizing and sometimes killing civilians in southern Israel who were living in the border regions. The war killed 1,400 Gazans, roughly, of whom 288 were children and 103 were women. On the Israeli side, there were 10 Israeli soldiers killed and 3 Israeli civilians killed. So that kind of gives you an idea of the balance of force in this war. I came into Gaza in January of 2010, a year after the war, and during that time, a major international news event happened. There was a flotilla of ships that was carrying about over 600 unarmed humanitarian activists. The largest ship was called the Mavi Marmara, and they were attempting to break the land and sea blockade of Gaza. They carried 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid with an estimated value of $20 million. A majority were Turkish activists, but there were also many dozens of Western activists and journalists from Europe, the US, and Canada, and even Palestinian Israeli Knesset members. Israeli commandos raided the ship in international waters. They came down from helicopters with guns, and when some of the activists aboard the Mavi Marmara resisted being arrested, there's various accounts of what exactly happened, but at the worst, these activists were wielding kitchen knives, and there's various reports of whether they were or were not wielding kitchen knives. They were fired upon and killed. 9 activists died on the ship, and one later died after being in a coma for many months. Fast forward 4 more years, there was another devastating war, again between Israel and Hamas, again after attempts at ceasefires and rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel and tunnels being built under the border. In this war, more than 2,000 Gazans were killed. Of them, 490 were children. And in this war, 64 Israelis were killed, including 6 civilians, one of whom was a child. So again, just devastating death toll counts and very disproportionate. Okay, so when I came into Gaza in 2010, there were a lot of things that I learned in my first few weeks that seemed like obvious news stories. And this was one of them. This is a family called the Hammad family. Their father was my taxi cab driver in Jordan, so I went to their house for tea, and this was the house. It had been mostly destroyed during the war. There was one room that was still standing. I'm not an architect, but it didn't look very structurally sound to me. And this is where the family was living. A year later, I have every reason to believe this is a family of non-combatants with no connection to, the extremist groups, and their home could not be rebuilt. You could find cement everywhere in Gaza, but it was extremely expensive because it was forbidden under the blockade and being smuggled in through Egypt. So Hamas could buy cement. Hamas is funded by Iran, and they could buy the cement, use it to make tunnels, for example, which is the reason supposedly for the cement being forbidden. But families like this could not afford the expensive cement that was coming in through tunnels from Egypt. So as a journalist coming in for the first time, this seemed like an obvious story. And I'll talk later on about why these stories were so difficult to get published. Another obvious story was about the devastating impact of the blockade. As I said earlier, Gaza's kids are anemic. Fish are a source of protein. And Gaza is a coastal enclave. It used to have a thriving fishing industry. Most of the fish that you find in Gaza now come in through the tunnels from Egypt, not from Gaza's existing fishing industry. And they're very expensive because they're coming through the tunnels. So the average person in Gaza can't afford them. So I'm going to show you a 2-minute video that tells the story of one of these fishermen. His name is Mahfouz Kabariti. After being fired on and nearly killed on multiple occasions by Israeli gunboats when he tried to go into deeper waters to catch the largest pool of fish, he would get fired upon because of the naval blockade. And he ultimately decided to abandon his livelihood and just take groups and school kids out for rides on his boat close to the shore, where they wouldn't get fired upon. Often he does this for no money. It's just a community service that he does to bring some joy into people's lives.
My name is Mahfouz Kabariti. I am a former fisherman. This is both belong to me and other friends. It was for fishing here, but now we changed it to be for leisure and for kids to take the kids as a trip in the sea. During the time when we were working as a fisherman boat, we got enough, we couldn't get enough money, income, even for the fuel of the boat, because the sea is a restricted area within 3 miles. We didn't want the people give us money and stay waiting our chance. We want raw materials, we want to work, so we want our economy to be in good, normal situation and good situation. We want to sell our goods. We want to go fish in our water, the 20 miles. We don't want to grant or to get money from this country or this association. This is not cure. This is only as a drug for period of time. We didn't against a Jewish as a human or a religion. No, we hate the occupation. That's the point.
Were you guys able to understand what he was saying? It's a little bit. Okay, so to summarize, thanks for your honesty. Okay, so to.
My relationship with New York is like in
Just a second.
abusive relationship with this stinky.
I don't know what that is. All right, so the gist of what he was saying is, you know, he used to be a fisherman, couldn't be a fisherman anymore because when he tried to go out to the deep waters where you can catch a livable amount of fish, he would get fired upon. He also made 2, I think, striking comments. One was, he said, we don't hate the Jews as a people, we hate the occupation. And he said, we don't want, the gist of it was, we don't want handouts. We don't want, you know, fish from Egypt and aid from the UN. We want to have our own economy. We used to have our own economy, and we can't do that. So we're just, you know, sitting here surviving on handouts. Another story that seemed, again, like an obvious story to cover when I arrived in Gaza was about what was happening with the tunnels. The tunnels were becoming the new border in Gaza. How many of you here saw the movie Rachel last week? Okay. So for those of you who haven't seen the movie or aren't familiar, Rachel Corrie was an American who was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer in 2003 while she was attempting to protect a Palestinian home from demolition. I actually covered her family's wrongful death suit in Israeli courts, and I'm happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A. During the time that Rachel was in Gaza in 2003, the Second Intifada was raging. Buses were blowing up in Israel. Palestinians were living under curfew and having their communities raided constantly with many casualties every week. And in Gaza, Israel was destroying literally thousands of homes along the border on suspicion that these homes might be hiding entrances to tunnels. At that time, the tunnels were primarily used to smuggle weapons and rockets into Gaza from Egypt, usually with funding from Iran. But by the time I came to Gaza in 2010, tunnels were not used primarily to smuggle weapons. The vast majority were now used to bring in ordinary supplies, like that list of items forbidden under the blockade, everything from milk and diapers and potato chips. Even though, this is kind of funny, the lion at the zoo was smuggled into Gaza through a tunnel. Like it was literally the new border. Everything that you'd normally take across the border now came through the tunnels. And by the way, it's the most miserable zoo you've ever seen. Like it's all these animals in tiny little cages. The zoo is like, it's exactly the sort of zoo you'd expect to find in Gaza. In 2010, the World Bank, which is again when I was in Gaza, the World Bank reported that 80% of Gaza's imports now came through the tunnels. So I'm not just telling you it's the new border. It's, there's a lot of data to back this up. The tunnel owners paid an annual license fee to Hamas, and this became a huge source of revenue for Hamas. One thing that surprised me, I'd seen stories about the tunnels before I came, and I thought, wow, these journalists must be really well connected to be able to get inside a tunnel and, talk to tunnel owners. You go to Rafah, which is a city in southern Gaza, there were white tents all along the border. Each white tent was the entrance to a different tunnel. You could literally walk up to the tunnel, say, hi, I'm Ashley, I'm a journalist from America, can I take a picture of your tunnel? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. This is a picture I took in a tunnel. And it was not difficult to take this picture at all. And by the way, Palestinians generally don't want their pictures taken inside a tunnel because it shows they're involved in an illegal industry. But, when you see a picture like this in the West, it looks like he's a terrorist or something. It's a kid going through the tunnel bringing potato chips and stuff, So as you can kind of see from this picture, this is pretty shoddy construction inside these tunnels. They're extremely dangerous. They collapse all the time. There's no safety regulations. They're regularly bombed by Israel and flooded by Egypt whenever there's some suspicion that there's weapons going through the tunnels. Egyptian, on the Gaza side, there's all these white tents and, people standing outside. On the Egyptian side, it's also out in the open. I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, there's Egyptian soldiers standing at the entrance to each tunnel. They're checking for weapons, and if it's just potato chips and such, they let everything through. It's mostly kids working in the tunnels because they're shorter, and they can, if they're short enough, they can walk through the tunnels instead of having to hunch over. And every year, there were dozens of kids killed and hundreds injured in all sorts of horrible things that happened inside these tunnels. Collapses, explosions. A very common issue was electrocution from faulty wiring inside the tunnel. In 2010, the World Bank estimated that 6,000 young boys were working in the tunnels. So this was a proliferating industry in the context of no jobs, no income, no exports, total blockade. Also, the tunnels were becoming the new border in another sense. People who desperately needed medical treatment were traveling through the tunnels to Egypt to try to get treatment that they couldn't get in Gaza. Abu Yusuf is the father of a kid. Abu Yusuf means father of Yusuf. So he's the father of a kid named Yusuf who was hit in the eye with a stone, and they couldn't treat him in Gaza. They couldn't save his eye, and the next day he had his wife, because the Egyptian soldiers are less likely to arrest children or women, bring Yusuf through the tunnel into Egypt to try to bring him to a hospital in Egypt where they could save his eye. They did get to the hospital. The Egyptian soldiers did get them through, but they were unable to save Yusuf's eye, so he only sees through one eye. This man here, Suhail, he's a man who has a curable medical condition that will ultimately lead to paralysis, and he had been denied a request to get treated in an Israeli hospital. Those requests now almost exclusively are for children. Children do still cross the border occasionally to get medical treatment in Israel, but someone like him is very unlikely to get permission. And he had filed an appeal and was planning to go to Egypt as a last recourse through the tunnel if he wasn't able to get the medical treatment that he needed. So the first nonviolent demonstration I covered was actually aimed at a Palestinian audience. It was a demonstration organized by community groups that was calling upon tunnel owners and Palestinian parents to stop letting children work in the tunnels. These are, pretend coffins with children on top of them. Symbolizing all of the children who have died in the tunnel in the past year. It was the first demonstration of its kind. The signs say things like, tunnel owners, let our children live their childhoods. Tunnel owners, save our children from death. One of the organizers of the demonstration, Iman al-Qutba, said the families, the government, the schools, and the human rights organizations should all work together to stop the work of children in the tunnels. In other parts of the world, children go to playgrounds, do sports, sing and dance. They have childhoods. Here, our children go underground. This demonstration was many months in the making. Hamas was very reluctant to let it go forward. Any demonstration in Gaza has to be approved by Hamas. But they ultimately supported it because it was sort of non-political. I think it raised consciousness. I don't really know about the impact that it had. There was actually someone in the audience who I spoke to, Anis, which means mother of Anis, whose child worked in the tunnels and had lost 3 of his fingers being electrocuted from faulty wiring in the tunnels. And she said, the demonstrators don't want our kids to work in the tunnels. Okay, fine, but bring them different work. I fear for my children every day. God willing, when the border opens, it will be a happy day. So I actually sat down with this family and went over their financial situation, you know, how much they pay for rent. Their family's home was one of the homes that was demolished in the Second Intifada, one of the homes that Rachel Corrie, I don't know if Rachel Corrie was protecting their home, but that, you know, was in the border region and that Israeli bulldozers were demolishing. So they used to have a home. They were now paying rent that was expensive for them, and they couldn't make ends meet without the income that the husband had died. They couldn't make ends meet without the income that they were getting from their kids working in the tunnels. So I pitched dozens, literally dozens, many more probably, of stories about kids working in tunnels, fishermen not being able to earn their livelihoods, civilians not being able to rebuild their homes. And I could only get stories like these covered in very left-wing European outlets and very, you know, not very widely read, frankly, European outlets and Arab media outlets. The response from more mainstream U.S. media organizations looked like this. This was a response to a story about it's a year after the war and there's no reconstruction happening. How could this be? We don't have the budget to keep running first-person hardship stories from Gaza, as worthy as this may be. This was absolutely typical. This is not, you know, an isolated response. Here are some headlines just to give you an idea of stories I was able to publish during this time. Gaza journalists hopeful that press freedoms will persist. This is an article in the Columbia Journalism Review about the situation of Western journalists in Gaza after a British filmmaker named Paul Martin was arrested by Hamas. The filmmaker had been asking around about the whereabouts of Gilad Shalit, who is an Israeli soldier imprisoned in Gaza, and not so surprisingly was thought to be a spy. And so a worthy news story was, you know, after this journalist is arrested in Gaza, who's, you know, doesn't sound like the smartest of journalists, what's the status of press freedom in Gaza? Hamas takes the low road. This was an article I wrote about Hamas raids on secular leftist nonprofits in Gaza. They were shutting down leftist nonprofits in Gaza. Is Hamas robbing the poor? This was an article I wrote for the Huffington Post about people scrounging for raw materials in destroyed buildings, and Hamas was taxing them. I was able to publish an article about the tunnel industry in the Jerusalem Post magazine, which is an Israeli magazine, and, you know, for me was quite an accomplishment to be able to speak to an Israeli audience. And I considered it a major achievement that a few buried paragraphs in this very long magazine article told stories about people traveling through the tunnels for medical treatment and about the demonstration against child labor in the tunnels. But the headline of the article still was, "From the Trenches, a first-hand look at the Gaza-Egypt border tunnel." So you really had to read through the article to get to the humanitarian story. And for me, that was very frustrating. The headlines that were screaming at me as a, you know, person new to Gaza, just looking around, were not the headlines that I was able to publish. Okay, I'm getting to the focus of the, as I said, a lot of background, but I think you'll see when we get there, this background is important. So how many of you are familiar with the story of Bil'in in the West Bank? Just a few. Okay. Well, how many of you have seen 10 Broken Cameras? As I know that's part of this. Okay. So for many years in Bil'in, again in the West Bank, separate, there had been a weekly protest movement because Israel was constructing a wall around and through the West Bank that in Bil'in was separating farmers from their farmland. It literally cut right between the village and the farmland in what certainly appeared to be an obvious land grab. The farmland was right next to a settlement that was looking to expand, and it was hard to stand there looking at it and say, is this a security fence or is this a land grab? In response, Palestinians, sometimes with support from left-wing Israelis and international activists, organized a nonviolent protest march every Friday for many, many years. Typically, kids at the front of the group would throw some stones at Israeli tanks, who would then reply with tear gas, skunk cannons, and rubber bullets. Sometimes tear gas canisters and rubber bullets, and you can see this is a lot of tear gas. I mean, this is... and by the way, this is one of the photos I did not take. This is a New York Times photo of the protests in Bil'in. Sometimes the tear gas canisters in particular, if they were fired at close range, did kill activists or seriously injure them. We knew an activist in Berkeley who was paralyzed at one of these demonstrations named Tristan. But as an observer of these demonstrations who sort of stayed toward the back, I never actually feared for my life when I was personally in Bil'in. I just had the extremely unpleasant experience of witnessing an obvious injustice and use of disproportionate force, and of feeling my eyes and throat burning from a lot of tear gas. Bil'in is one of the few places in the Palestinian territories where protesters have won victories in the Israeli court system. In September of 2007, the Israeli Supreme Court decided that the wall in Bil'in created, quote, undue hardship and had to be rerouted. And it took many years after that for the IDF to finally reroute the wall, or at this point it was a fence. Okay, so all of this that was happening in Bil'in was being watched by people in Gaza. Even though they're territorially separate, they watch the news, they have access to the internet, even with 4 to 8 hours of electricity a day. They had been closely watching developments in Bil'in, a group of leftist activists in Gaza, and wondering if they could do something similar. In January of 2010, right around the time that I arrived, Israeli helicopters dropped these flyers all around the border areas of Gaza, informing people that for security reasons, the buffer zone was now going to be expanded from 150 to 300 meters. Israel's justification is that, which is, it is a fact that tunnels are often located at in the buffer zone along the border, entrances to tunnels, and rockets, these rockets that are fired into southern Israel, are often launched from the buffer zone. If you enter the buffer zone, it's not marked in any way. There's no sign in Gaza that says, you have entered the buffer zone. It's just sort of an arbitrary distance between the border, and the buffer zone doesn't go into the Israeli side of the border. It only comes into the Gaza side. If you enter the buffer zone, again, not marked, you will be assumed to be a terrorist and will be shot at with live ammunition by an Israeli sniper. This means that 300 meters is effectively more like 500 meters, because who wants to take the shot, the chance of, if you can't tell where it is, you don't want to get anywhere close to 300 meters because you might get shot at. And again, it's very important just for context to understand how small Gaza is. The UN said at the time when this expansion was announced that it would destroy 30% of the arable land in Gaza. This is Gaza that is desperately needing fresh food, whose population is already malnourished. Not to mention that this expansion from 150 to 300 is going to make many people homeless who are unlucky and with no compensation whatsoever, who are unlucky enough to live in that area. So This is Sabra. He's one of the main organizers of this protest movement that started shortly thereafter, about a month later, in response to Israel's expansion of the buffer zone. He's an extremely warm and kind person. He used to be a Fatah police officer. He has a wife and 3 young kids who are always running around when we talked. It is unusual that he has a picture of Che Guevara in his living room. Most people in Gaza have, if they have a picture of someone, it's a picture of Yasser Arafat or of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who's the founder of Hamas. Sabra said he admired Guevara for, quote, starting an international revolution against oppression. Another, I guess, fun fact that was rather unnerving for me, he was convinced that I was Israeli. When we first met, he said, "You are Israeli, I am Palestinian. I want us both to say to our governments that we can live together in peace." And I was like, well, I agree with that, but I'm not Israeli, you know? And he sort of winked and said, okay, well, I'm just saying, for example, you know? So I never quite knew where to take that, but anyways, I guess an important thing to note about that is he thought I was Israeli, but was still willing to, and eager to talk to me. So, although I'm not Israeli. He studied sociology at the Islamic University of Gaza and has never in his life traveled outside of Gaza. He was friends with Israeli journalist Amira Haas, who some of you might read, when she was living in Gaza, and still corresponds with a lot of left-wing parliamentarians, including Jewish Israeli parliamentarians. During and after the 2008-2009 war, he was planning large-scale demonstrations and then dropped those plans, but felt that this new flyer was something that could really mobilize people. He said, "I want to experiment with this strategy in Gaza. The strength of these demonstrations is that they attract international activists and journalists to see what's really happening." So in January of 2010, he visited universities and community organizations across Gaza, rallied some support for transportation expenses and Palestinian flags, and he received no funding from Fatah or Hamas. And the plan was basically to march into the buffer zone and plant Palestinian flags along the border as a way of sort of symbolically showing this is Palestinian land and we won't accept it being, you know, taken from us without our consent. This is a photo that I took at one of these demonstrations in March of 2010. There were about 50 to 60 activists, almost all men, all of them unarmed. That was a very clear instruction that you could be from any political party, but you couldn't bring weapons. The vast majority, though, if not everyone, came from Fatah or other left-wing Palestinian political factions. They marched into the buffer zone. They planted their started planting their flags, and there was no skunk cannons or rubber bullets or anything like I had seen in the West Bank. There was live ammunition, actual bullets. They started firing at the ground. People started running back. I actually tripped and fell at some point, so I had been toward the back of the group, but found myself sort of in the back closer to the border because I tripped and fell. Bullets did go by me. It was the first time in Gaza that I ever feared for my life. I came back in total shock that something like this could actually happen. You know, it took a few hours to really, oh my God, I was actually just shot at, and so how can this happen? How does this, how is this not, you know, a major news story? I did continue to cover the demonstrations, but I stayed way back. I wore, you know, my bright journalist vest, and I tried without success. I did publish stories in some very, you know, fringe leftist outlets, but was never able to get traction for these stories in more mainstream outlets. As the movement started to spread, it wasn't just shooting at the ground anymore. It was shooting at people's legs and then shooting at people's torsos if they, you know, continued advancing toward the border. This is a young woman named Hind. She's 22, and I don't know how well you can see it, but this is the bullet. It's like right here. It's in her hip. She's extraordinarily lucky to be alive, and she was shot at one of these demonstrations. Activists, as you can imagine, there was one activist killed at the same demonstration, one other, an activist named Bianca from Malta, who was shot in the leg, and you know, many other injured and killed during this time period in Gaza, at least 10 total killed. In many of these cases, the protesters had separated from the group to plant flags as close to the border as possible. Sometimes they had thrown stones. And typically the Israeli news report said something like a suspected terrorist was shot trying to cross the border. Sabra tried very hard to keep the group together. He told people to lock arms, not to separate. He tried to stop the stone throwing, you know, to avoid any provocation. But it was a very unwieldy movement. Sometimes protests happened that were planned, sometimes they were less planned. It was very difficult to control. And as I said, people started getting killed. This was an interview I did with a top Hamas official named Salah Bardawil, May 28, which is an important date to note. This is 3 days before the flotilla tragedy. And I'm asking him about the nonviolent resistance movement that's been growing along the borders in Gaza. The general perception in the public at the time was that these protesters were kind of making themselves sitting ducks. They were foolish to think that anything would be accomplished by this, and they're just getting people killed and stirring up trouble. And that was kind of the view from Hamas as well. They were concerned that Israel would portray the protesters as aggressors and use them as an excuse to launch another invasion or stir up another war. There was an undeclared ceasefire at the time that Hamas wanted to maintain. And Hamas didn't agree tactically, you know, in principle with they saw nonviolence as something that could be a tactic from time to time, but not as an overarching philosophy and strategy of resistance the way it was for Sabra and most of the people in this movement. By the time of this interview with Salah Bardawil, at least 10 activists had been killed in buffer zone demonstrations. Okay, so this next slide I'm going to show you, I went back and forth about whether or not to include. I do want to warn you that it's an extremely graphic image, so you're welcome to turn away if you don't want to see it. But I think it's important to show because, if only for a few seconds, because an image like this is something that everyone in Gaza has seen at some point in their lives. It's seared into the national consciousness. The closeness of death is everywhere. So this is an image of a young man named Ahmed Deeb. He was 19 years old. He was unarmed, being carried away by demonstrators after he was shot in the femoral artery, you know, right here, and dying of blood loss. So this is Ahmed. Okay. So then everything changed literally overnight. On May 31st, 2010, my apartment was right next to the fishing port in Gaza, and I woke up early in the morning to the sound of a blaring loudspeaker telling everyone that Israeli troops had committed a massacre aboard the flotilla, and for everybody to come down to the harbor for a press conference gathering, etc. Everyone was there, leaders from all of the political factions in Gaza, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, PFLP. In speech after speech, they slammed Israel's actions as an act of state terrorism and called on the international community to defend the activists and stop the siege of Gaza. Fatah would not take the stage with Hamas, but they did get up on the stage themselves right after Hamas had left, which was sort of, I guess, the compromise that was broached. It was this rare moment in a country, or not country, but, you know, territory, don't know what to call it, where Gaza seemed unified, where people were united around something. Western country after country were condemning Israel's flotilla raid in the strongest possible terms. The United Nations Security Council condemned, quote, those acts which resulted in the loss of lives. They called for a prompt investigation. The UN Human Rights Council called the attack outrageous and dispatched a fact-finding mission to investigate violations of international law. Israel found itself in an unprecedented diplomatic crisis with Turkey. Arab countries, Egypt in particular, were under huge pressure from their people to do something to help Gaza, particularly, as I said, Egypt. And the pervading feeling in Gaza was this sense of sudden hope and optimism. People who had felt like they were rats in an open-air prison and nobody in the world cared about them finally felt like, wow, things might change. This is our moment. The international eyes are on us. And they were. This is the same American editor who a few months before told me she wasn't interested in my humanitarian stories from Gaza. Exact same person, same news organization. And this was not an anomaly. This was the general trend. The same humanitarian stories about suffering in Gaza due to Israeli policies of collective punishment that I had been unable to publish a few months before were suddenly in hot demand from the very same publications that had refused them. A notable line, I won't read you the whole email. I know we're a little short on, wow, we're very short on time. Interested in a sense of how Gazans feel now that the world is suddenly waking up to the fact that they've been living under siege for 3 years. Are they encouraged or pissed off or some strange combo of the two? So almost overnight, participation in these buffer zone demonstrations surges. This is a photo that I took on a bus. They're now literally busing people to the borders, which says a lot. You know, Palestinian civil society organizations are paying for buses that are bringing people to the borders, and the demographics are changing. This is a bus full of women. It's at least half women now, these demonstrations. Everyone with their hand in the air is new. They're coming for the first time. One of the participants on this bus, someone named Mesa Abbas, says, all of us are going to this demonstration in solidarity with the Freedom Flotilla. We're trying to break the siege in any way we can. Again, siege means blockade. We want the Arab world and the rest of the world to pay attention to our suffering. In late June, I went to a demonstration. Again, early on, it was like 50 people max at these demonstrations. Now there's 350 people. They're locking arms. They're unified. They're going deeper, much deeper into the buffer zone, almost to the border, planting Palestinian flags. And Israeli snipers don't fire a single shot. Nothing. They let them plant the flags. They go back. They retreat. There is no gunfire whatsoever. And at the risk of stating the obvious, I don't think Israel had the political capital in this moment to fire because the whole world literally was watching. So they had to let the demonstrations advance. Sabra said at the time, the power of these demonstrations is that they attract international attention to what's happening. We want foreigners, especially Americans and Israelis, to tell their governments that we should stop the violence and live together in peace. He also said at the time that he was planning to launch an Arabic, English, Hebrew website about the anti-buffer zone movement and to network with foreign activist groups. He successfully organized a video conference, which might seem like a normal thing here. A video conference in Gaza is like amazing. How do you even set up the technology? He organized a video conference with activists in Bil'in so that they could share strategies, join forces. There were at least 250 people at this video conference. The technology was a little scrappy, like you couldn't totally, but the point was, there's solidarity between our two movements. Yet still, most mainstream media coverage focused on the aid crisis, which was a relatively safe topic that Israel could take steps to alleviate and ultimately did. I did write a story about this movement for an organization called Global Post, which is I guess, mainstream in its politics, but not very widely known. It's sort of an alternative to the AP and Reuters that was coming up at the time, and small news organizations could buy their stories. But the New York Times, for example, did not feature it as a story as such. It was mentioned in a paragraph buried within articles. Nick Kristof, a New York Times columnist, mentioned it in a column about Palestinian nonviolent resistance in general. It said, oh, and by the way, there's this thing happening in Gaza, but it wasn't featured as a story, as a front, it was not a major news item. So just to give you another sense of the sentiment at the time, this picture here is posters carried by schoolgirls in Gaza that say the names of the hero journalists aboard the Freedom Flotilla. Again, there's this feeling that people are watching us, people care. This is another quote from a demonstrator. I won't read it all to you in the sense of time, but you get the general idea. They feel people are paying attention, and they suddenly feel compelled to do something, to defend their land and their people. Okay, but this didn't last, unfortunately. I left Gaza in July of 2010. I stayed in touch intermittently with Sabra and tried to follow the news through news organizations that I knew were covering these sorts of things to some extent. That fall, due to massive outrage across the Arab world, Egypt's government, which was still ruled by Hosni Mubarak at the time, opened the Rafah crossing. Again, one of the two ways to get into Gaza legally, not through tunnels. And humanitarian aid and medical aid started to enter, and some people from Gaza were able to travel abroad for medical treatment, for school, for the things that people travel abroad for. Also that fall, Israel substantially eased the blockade. Most of those food items that you heard me list, sugar, etc., that were inexplicably banned in the first place, were now allowed in. And at oddly the same time, Israel started firing on these buffer zone demonstrators again. At least 8 more activists were killed. These events were mainly covered in the Arab press and, again, in the ultra-left-wing Western press. As before, the typical line was a suspected terrorist was killed trying to cross the border. Often it was described as a skirmish, and the smaller the crowds got, and as the firing started, the crowds got smaller. Skirmish became a more accurate description. If you didn't have a large group of obvious demonstrators locking hands and staying together, you could reframe what it was. Participation in the demonstrations rapidly declined, and by December of 2010, Sabra and his co-organizers had thrown in the towel and effectively ended the movement as such. It sort of continued sporadically, but without any central organization. And elsewhere in the Arab world, the Arab Spring was happening. Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in February of 2011. Notably, the border stayed open. The Rafah crossing stayed open under the Morsi government, and even for a short time after Sisi in Egypt overthrew Morsi. But it closed again in October of 2014, and with a few exceptions, every now and then it's open for a few days, and humanitarian aid can come in, or these conjoined twins can travel abroad to go get medical treatment in Bahrain or whatever. It's effectively closed. So it's been closed ever since October of 2014. This is my last slide. I came back to Gaza in 2012, about 2 years later. And on the first day, I visited the Hammad family again. This is now 3 years after the Operation Cast Lead, after the 2008-2009 war. And 3 years later, the Hammad family, this family of civilians, no connection to militants, had finally received money from the UN to rebuild their home. Their home would never, ever have been rebuilt, I really believe this, if it were not for the flotilla tragedy and the international outcry that it had inspired. But as it goes in Gaza, this was sort of for naught. I mean, 2014, 2 years later, many of these rebuilt homes were then destroyed again in the 2014 war. When I came back in 2012, I also learned that some of my Gazan journalist friends who had helped me a lot, had traveled abroad for the first time. One story was a female journalist named Nagam, really amazing person. She's a filmmaker. She was working on a film, believe it or not, called Romance in Gaza, about love and relationships despite, you know, the reality of life in Gaza. And she had, because of the Rafah crossing to Egypt opening for a short period of time, been able to travel to Greece to work on her film. When I look back, I think the protest movement was sort of doomed from the start. In the context of tremendous pressure on mainstream media to tell a balanced story that doesn't condemn Israeli violence too harshly, and in the context of Gaza's extreme isolation and the extreme violence used on protesters by the IDF, it was all but impossible for a nonviolent movement to flourish. What I want to close with is this photo from the beach in Gaza. The beach is the place in Gaza where I went when I wanted to feel a little bit hopeful, and it is a hopeful place. It's a place where you see young children and families playing in the water and finding joy, and people riding horses and roasting peanuts despite the trauma and horror that they're seeing all around them. And in a forgotten and devastated place like Gaza, maybe going to the beach and asserting your humanity is itself a form of nonviolent resistance. So that's mine. Yep.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I'd like to, just a reminder that this colloquium is brought to you open to the general public, but it's based as a graduate and undergraduate course. So we will go until 1:30 with members of the community and the general public, and then at 1:30 we'll transition and ask you to give us the room. Students who are enrolled will remain, and we'll have the last half hour to interact more directly with the guest speaker. So let's turn it to the audience until 1:30, and your questions, issues for discussion. What's on your mind?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You have a story to tell,
Mm-hmm.
and I heard your frustration about not being able to get that story told in the United States, you know, in a paper magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought about writing a book about it?
Not seriously. I don't know. I didn't take the type of notes at the time that would be, you know, I would be working from memory and from, I think I would have to go back in order to write such a book. It would have to be rooted in the present, and for a number of reasons that are, reflect the tragedy of Gaza, I'm not sure I can go back. One reason is I'm married to an Israeli, and that's sort of known now among some of the people I know. The vast majority of people I know in Gaza, you know, that wouldn't put me in any risk at all, but there are extremist groups in Gaza, and you know, Gaza is becoming a more and more extreme place because of all of the things I described. It's almost inevitable, and I don't know if I'm the right person to tell that story, but I hope that somebody is, and I hope there's some way I can help support them in telling that story.
Thank you.
Well, the woman who's coming, Alice Rothschild, will tell some of that story.
Mm-hmm.
She's been a doctor and been
Israeli.
She's an American Jewish woman, doctor, but she will tell that story. She's worked in Gaza.
What's the date of her talk?
22nd of October, Sunday, at the Unitarian Church at 3 o'clock.
There's some pamphlets out there.
All right.
She's got good stories to tell. I mean, she's an amazing woman.
Before. She's really good.
I'll be there.
Okay, good.
Yes, Sylvia.
You know, as you know, I was in Israel-Palestine in May and spent most of the time with Palestinian people in Bethlehem and, you know, traveling around the country and so on. And one of the things that I found, and it was reflected a week ago in the Palestinian travel guide, when, I forget his name, I'm sorry, that spoke to us,
Yeah.
is that there's sort of a loss of faith in that the two-state solution is still possible, mostly because of the settlements, and the settlements increasingly are humongous condominiums all over the place, particularly in the West Bank, you know, so, but I don't know, I myself still think, I mean, like, for example, when you talked about Gaza and how the Israeli government pulled out the settlements out of there. And I live by the football stadium here in Ann Arbor, you know, where they pulled out a lot of homes in order to make room for the football stadium and the golf course and so on. And so it seems to me that it would still be better to go for the two-state solution, thinking in terms of, you know, either moving people out or they can stay if they know that they're going to stay.
Well, first of all, there are no more settlements in Gaza.
Right.
I know you know
Right.
that, but for the,
Right. No, I think my question is, should we forget about the two-state solution? Because I still think that it would be the better solution. But increasingly I hear, particularly from Palestinian people, that,
I'm going to go back to this
that it's no
map.
longer a possible solution.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I'd say is look at the map. You know, a two-state solution would need to have some way of linking Gaza and the West Bank, and that's a lot of distance to link. Most of the news coverage you see of a two-state solution is as if Gaza doesn't exist. They're not talking about a two-state solution between Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. They're talking about a two-state solution between Israel and the West Bank, and we'll deal with Gaza later because that's just a terrorist hellhole or something. You know, Gaza is completely out of the picture. And in terms of what I think about a two-state versus one-state solution, I wonder if a two-state solution is possible given this territorial reality and the fact that there are settlements deep into the West Bank that have hundreds of thousands of people, including Ariel, which is like smack dab in the middle of the West Bank. You know, when you start looking at the map and try to figure out what would a contiguous Palestinian state look like, it's hard to see that without massive, you know, abandoning of the settlements, and the Israeli government will, at least the current state of the government, won't allow that. On the other hand, if you were to just lift the borders today, yeah, thousands of people would die. You know, you can't just do a one state and people live together in peace. That not after everything that's happened. It would take decades, but you know, it has been done in other conflicts. You know, look at Northern Ireland, look at all sorts of different conflict regions around the world where at one point in history people were saying there's no way you can live together, and you know, decades later nobody's walking down the streets and thinking these two groups are going to kill each other. So it can be done, it has been done, but it can't be done overnight, not with all of the context of what's happened. I don't know. I wish I could see a political path forward. I don't. At least in the short term, unless a different government is elected in Israel unless on both sides there's governments that are willing to really go against, particularly in Israel, go against the popular will, which is increasingly right-wing. It's not looking very hopeful. Yeah.
Gaza is a latter-day Warsaw ghetto, and from what you've said, there is no chance of getting any discussion of the similarity published.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the basic history of the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't know that I'm familiar enough to comment, you know, eloquently on that, but it is a ghetto, and ghettos are horrible places to live, desperate places to live, and desperation breeds extremism. And unless you get at people's, basic needs, not just needs for sustenance, but basic needs for dignity and freedom and hope, you're never going to get to those larger, political questions. Yeah.
My question's about just the idea of nonviolent resistance in Gaza.
Would you speak
I'm
more
sorry.
loudly,
Yeah,
please?
absolutely. I guess my question is in relation to the idea of nonviolent resistance in Gaza and its possibility of existing, especially if, and this is not to in any way praising Hamas, but if settlements are able to go away, and that's when that occurs, for anyone that's there, that seems like they've done something. And so what would be, and then the other example is, you have people who are nonviolently resisting and they die. So it seems like if you have two examples, and this is not me speaking to the politics in any way, it doesn't bode well for nonviolence if you're going to die anyway with no results. So what does that mean for Gaza and anything? I mean, for a path forward. I don't know if you have an answer, but
Yeah.
it made it struggling when you mentioned like, okay, there's settlements go away. This, if anything, encourages something else, and then an attempted nonviolent resistance occurs and people die, and there's no results.
So settlements went away in 2005, and in 2007, Gaza got the blockade.
Right.
So it's not that, and the settlements didn't go away really as an achievement of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. If anything, frankly, you could say they went away because it was an achievement of violent resistance. Settlers were getting attacked by Palestinians who, quite understandably so, resented their presence in Gaza. It's a Jewish-only community protected by the IDF, better roads, better infrastructure, better everything. Palestinians are left with nothing. The settlers are getting everything. I would never support violence, but you can understand the situation that leads to that kind of violence. I would argue that Israel withdrew from the settlements because it was getting too costly to try to defend them in the context of Palestinian violent resistance against the settlements. And Israel pulled out voluntarily because it just wanted Gaza, it didn't want to have to deal with Gaza anymore. And then it blockaded Gaza. It wanted, so it was not at all a success of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. If anything, it was the opposite.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll transition to the room with the guest, the graduate students and undergraduates in the class. One more question?
Maybe you can both ask your question real quick, and I'll try to answer both of them quickly.
Mine wasn't a question, it was just adding on to what you said.
Oh, okay. Go
Just
ahead.
very simply put, like, settlements in Gaza are also demographically a lot smaller than they were in the West Bank. Which is something to think about as well.
Yeah,
It's a whole
so,
different
and the evacuation of them was a huge,
Very big
public
ordeal.
disaster in Israel. Like, to this day, the settlers are not reintegrated. The scenes across the world of settlers trying to stop the IDF from coming in and forcing them out. That was in a tiny settlement in Gaza. To try to do that in massive settlements in the West Bank, with a very right-leaning Israeli public is almost inconceivable. So yeah, thank you for that.
My question was, have you received any pushback from Hamas because of things that you published, about their opinions, and also, what is your current situation with being able to go to Israel? Because I know the political activists in Israel.
Yeah.
The
When I go to Israel, I'm strip searched, down to my underwear at the airport, but I am able to enter. I've always gone. We'll see. This next time I go, it'll be different because I'm not affiliated with the dialogue program anymore. So the fact that I work with an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue program, it would take me 4 hours-ish to clear security. I was always, making friends with the people in the deportation room in the airport. it's a room, there's usually a lot of migrants, and well, anyway, that's a whole different story. But so yeah, I have difficulty getting into Israel, but I've always gotten in. You know, I've always been able to explain why I was in Gaza and you know, why I have these stamps on my passport. I'm so sorry. Remind me the other part of your question. Hamas. Okay. So the story that I wrote that I was a little concerned about was a story about Hamas raids on secular nonprofits in Gaza, and Hamas knew, first of all, Hamas is not like a unified organization the way you think about Israel or the US or Western governments. Like, you can go to one spokesperson for Hamas and get a very militant statement, and go to another spokesperson for Hamas and get a much more moderate statement. There's not like the level of coordination that you get, you know, when you're dealing with Western governments. So there, I wouldn't say Hamas knew, but people within Hamas knew that I was writing this article, and I did include a quote from them with their perspective. So I'm sure they didn't like the article, but you know, it didn't have a huge or any impact on them. It was mainly read in the West, if at all, and they were fairly quoted. It was a quote about this raid on nonprofits is part of a tit-for-tat policy because Fatah is raiding all of our nonprofits in the West Bank. I never, though, you know, I would never write a story, for example, in Gaza about Gilad Shalit. That's like, you know, putting a big target sign on my head. Like, Gilad Shalit, again, was the Israeli soldier that was imprisoned kidnapped by Hamas and ultimately exchanged for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in a prisoner swap. So, you know, I did think about my own safety concerns in the stories that I would cover. Like, another example, I would never write about a Salafist group in Rafah. That's like an Al-Qaeda, now ISIS-linked group that wants all foreigners out of Gaza. You know, it would be really stupid to be like, oh, I want to write a story about this, you know, like I did self-censor, and, you know, in some ways, in the stories that I wrote and didn't write.
I want to thank members of the general public for joining us. And